leadership of the Labour Party, which has left the working people of this country without any defence or representation at all. A Labour Party which is a caricature of its name, which has no connection to the British working class, in fact doesn't even like them very much. And the British working people are repaying the compliment. The British people have fallen out of love with Labour. It's time for change. I'm George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, and every week at this time I'm here giving you how we see things from the point of view of the Workers' Party. Last week, 750,000 people watched all or part of this broadcast, which I think you'll agree is pretty spectacular. So make sure that you spread the news about this one. Share the content. Tell your friends that it's worth watching, even if only to get a different point of view to the one being pumped out endlessly 24/7 by the mainstream media. Now, just in case Mr. Algorithm is listening, we know where you live. We know that you are interfering with our communications. So that 750,000 may actually have been more. There was one point at which one of the clips from last week's broadcast had 10 times more likes and retweets than it had views, according to the official view counter. Go figure. So spread the news. Every week, 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, the Workers' Party is in town, telling you like it is from our point of view. Now, this is not just for members of the party. It's not even just for supporters of the party. Though I pull no punches, and of course I obfuscate nothing. I tell you exactly how I see things, how the Workers' Party view contemporary events. Tonight, I've got time for only 3 issues. The first is the absurdity of today's House of Commons. The idea that one fat man called Ian Blackford, the leader of the Scottish Separatist Party, the Nationalist Party, can make jokes about cakes with Boris Johnson, who jokes back that you look like you've had more cakes than me, that this can pass for parliamentary discourse in the middle of an international crisis, in the middle of multiple national crises affecting our people, our economy, our society, crime, disorder on the streets, murders, God knows what's going on in Britain. And these jokers are smashing pies into each other's faces, cakes into each other's faces. It's like the sixth form room at Greyfriars with Billy Bunter and co. Having a tea party. It's simply not up to the task of guiding our country through what is a very tense international situation. I'll tell you what though, the House of Commons was tearing itself apart over the issue of Partygate, whether the Prime Minister's birthday cake constituted a breach of the law worthy of £100 fine, and it's getting the best attention from the highest reaches of Scotland Yard. I wish that the murder victims and the victims of crime in London were getting the same attention. But whether a birthday cake with family, friends and staff in the cabinet room, as opposed to sitting at their desks in the same suite of office, constitutes a high crime and misdemeanor, well, you would have thought that British parliamentary democracy was just one step away from fisticuffs if you'd been watching it. But a moment later, when they turned to the subject of the Ukraine, there was absolute unanimity in the House. Penny Mordaunt, one of the Tory government ministers, said the House is as one on the subject of Ukraine. Now, I sat for nearly 30 years in the British Parliament, and if there's one thing that I learned, it's that when the House of Commons is unanimous, it is almost certainly unanimously wrong. Not a single voice. Can you believe that? Not one voice, not one Dennis Skinner, not one Jeremy Corbyn, not one George Galloway, not one Tony Benn, not one person
demurred from the prevailing narrative that Britain, beyond all other European countries, stands four square with President Biden in his stance on the crisis affecting the Ukraine and other areas of the post-Soviet Union. I found it astounding that not a single person raised a single discordant note or raised a single querulous note, even asked a serious question. It was all the drumbeats for war. I'm going to come back to that as my second subject. But I must say en passant, no matter how awful Boris Johnson is, no matter how venal, he's a cad, a bounder, a mountebank. He's everything that we in the Workers' Party despise in the British ruling class. He's a dissolute rake, like a character from the Regency period, exercising the droit de seigneur on any passing woman, married or single, that happens to cross his purview. He's a man without any moral sense at all, without a scintilla of emotional empathy or emotional intelligence. He's vile, okay? And yet the people that are trying to bring him down are more vile still. Just imagine that. It's a collection of disparate viewpoints. The Thatcherites don't like him because whatever else you call Boris Johnson, he's certainly not conservative, not with a track record like his. The Remainers probably constitute the main ramp in the Conservative Party to get him, because they think if they can get Johnson, they can, as their Tarzan, Lord Heseltine, Michael Heseltine, put it just yesterday, getting rid of Boris Johnson could begin to unravel the whole of Brexit. Believe it or not, even after all this time, there are still significant numbers of people who dream, and I mean dream, day and night, that somehow they can get back into the Elysian fields of the European Union. But a key describer of the fact that there's a coup going on is that Ofcom might not as well exist only for me perhaps, because all of the television stations in Britain, and I mean all of them, every single one of them, are all day and all night engaged in a coup to bring down the British Prime Minister, the mountebank Boris Johnson. And when you've got Channel 5, Channel 4, Sky News, BBC Television, BBC 2 on Newsnight, every BBC local radio station, even in Scotland, they are discussing tea parties in Downing Street. When Scotland's got its own parliament, its own so-called government, which is literally dripping in sleaze up to its neck in criminal behavior, actual criminal behavior. The police are investigating a missing sum of £600,000 from the Scottish governing party's internal coffers. And yet the television in Scotland is discussing a birthday cake in Downing Street in London. So I've lived through a lot in my life, and I know a coup when I see one. And this is a coup to get rid of Boris Johnson. From our point of view, in a way, what do we care? We'll despise the next Tory leader just as much as we despise Boris Johnson. But it shows the crises, multiple crises and divisions inside the British ruling elite. But they're united against Russia, the bear, big bad Boris. They're definitely keen to see the Russian government humiliated in Eastern Europe. All of them. Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Scottish nationalist, Welsh nationalist, so-called Greens, all of them utterly united behind the ultra-nationalist government in Kiev with its fascist battalions at the front. The Azov battalion, the swastika wearing, jack-booted, Holocaust-denying legions of Bandera who fell upon the Ukrainian Jews before the SS could even get there, who murdered Jews in Poland and in Ukraine. These are our allies in the Ukrainian imbroglio. So let me turn to that very imbroglio. The law of unintended consequences very frequently kicks in politics, and it certainly has on the European mainland as I speak to you this evening. The Hungarian Prime Minister has made clear that there is absolutely no way that Hungary is going to get involved in a military conflict between Ukraine and Russia. The Croatian president, Croatia of all places, denounced last night the events in 2014 in Ukraine as a US organized coup. He blamed Joe Biden for this entire crisis and said that if there is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, not only will Croatia not be sending forces into the maw, they'll be withdrawing all of their forces from NATO operations everywhere in the NATO theatre, which is, of course, now everywhere. The Polish Prime Minister, having said a couple of weeks ago that Poland was tired of criticizing China at the behest of the United States, has now said that the Polish government will not support the American plan to land American soldiers in Eastern European countries, 8,000 of them to begin with more already, no doubt, polishing their boots. Poland, Croatia, Hungary, France and Germany are meeting right at this minute, for a hot mic, so that we could hear what Schulz and Macron are actually saying. But the one thing we know that they are saying is that they absolutely have to be counted out of the war drive against Russia, particularly Germany, which faces an energy catastrophe if there is a war between NATO and Russia. Never mind the Nord Stream. Without Russian gas supplies, Germany would have to close down, and half of its people might freeze to death. Because, as Qatar made clear today, there isn't any way that they can make up the shortfall if the Russian gas is turned off. Germany is so disinclined to join in the Anglo-American policy, for that is now what it is, Anglo-American and Romanian. Let's be accurate, the Romanians are anybody's. They're definitely Joe Biden's. The Anglo-American policy towards Ukraine is now dividing NATO like never before. So something that was supposed to be a demonstration of NATO's prowess and unity has already, before a shot has been fired, sent NATO into absolute disarray. Bulgaria is the latest country to announce that there are no circumstances in which they will permit American soldiers on their soil, and no circumstances in which they will get involved in a war between Russia and Ukraine. So Joe Biden's going to need not 8,000 soldiers, not even 80, not even 800,000, but try 1,800,000 and try thinking about a new Vietnam, President Biden. That's how serious this conflict could become. So the question is there going to be a war? Well, I say exactly what I said last week. I hold to it. I do not believe that Russia has any intention at all of invading Ukraine. And the more you look through the lenses of the NATO binoculars themselves, the more obvious it is that there's going to be no Russian invasion of Ukraine. First of all, the soldiers that are always said to be massing on the border of Ukraine are 150 miles from the border with Ukraine. Secondly, as the Ukrainian president pointed out, 150,000 soldiers is not enough soldiers to mount an invasion of the Ukraine. On that, he was telling the truth. Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine, neither across the Ukrainian border nor through the Belarusian border. But again, I repeat what I said last week. The Russian people who live in eastern Ukraine, and that's what they are, Russian people, will be defended by Russia if the Kiev government forces attack them beyond the desultory couple of deaths a week that they have been extracting from those Russian people every day for the last 7 years. If there's a full-scale attack, if there's an attempt to destroy the so-called People's Republics in the Donbass, then obviously Russia will come to their aid. How could they not? First of all, hundreds of thousands of those people are actually Russian citizens with dual citizenship, with 2 passports. And millions of them are ethnically Russian. Their language is Russian. Their culture is Russian. They look east, not west. They still live a kind of time warp with an acute consciousness of the victory of the Red Army in 1945 and the role played by Ukrainian fascism in the Nazi occupation and rape of their country and mass murder of their compatriots. They're extremely patriotic to the patriotic war against fascism that was victorious in Berlin in 1945. So these are Russian nationals, they are Russian citizens, or they are ethnic Russians who have a right not to be subject to a genocidal attack by a government constituted at least in part of fascist battalions like the Azov battalions. So it's as it was last week, except it has concentrated the mind wonderfully everywhere except in the British House of Commons. Everyone is now beginning to recognize that Russia has a point. The Spectator magazine this week, that well-known Bolshevik publication, has a headline, "Whisper it softly, Putin has a point." Well, of course he has a point. The Ukraine is being turned into an armed Potemkin state by the United States and by NATO. And no Russian leader could possibly allow that development to go unchecked, unanswered. Whisper it softly, says the Spectator. I don't do whispering softly, as you have already worked out, so I'm shouting it out loud. The breaking of the promises made to Moscow by George Bush the First and by James Baker, his Secretary of State, written about voluminously by Baker in his memoirs, those promises have been broken and they need to be kept. And the most essential of those promises was that NATO would not advance beyond Germany once the Berlin Wall fell and East Germany ceased to be. That there would be no encroachment on the borders of Russia by NATO enlargement. And in particular, the idea that the Ukraine and Georgia can be turned into armed camps right on Russia's borderline is simply absurd. Just think about it. If Russia was backing a pro-Moscow government in Canada, sending its soldiers there, its weapons there, even its nuclear weapons there, you really think the Americans would just let that slide? You really think the Americans would have nothing to say or do if Moscow turned Canada into an armed camp with its guns all pointing into the United States? And maybe China down in Mexico, down Mexico way? Just think about it. How could any superpower possibly allow itself to be humiliated in that way? And on the subject of humiliation, and finally, for this evening, I found it a sad sight to see Jeremy Corbyn say how disappointed he was that the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, by a decisive margin, had decided to back Keir Starmer's exclusion of Corbyn. Just 2 years ago, the leader of the Labour Party, the most successful electoral leader of the Labour Party in 2017, since 1945 and Clement Attlee's landslide victory. He's now sadly disappointed that his own party will not support his own rights as a member of that party to receive Keir Starmer's whip in the House of Commons. I'm saddened for two reasons. I'm saddened because after 37 years in Parliament as a Labour Member of Parliament, Jeremy Corbyn deserves better than the humiliating treatment that he's receiving from Starmer and now by his own National Executive Committee. But I'm sad for a second reason. What would be achieved by Jeremy Corbyn receiving Keir Starmer's whip? How would that take anybody forward? Least of all Corbyn, who would be seen to be cowed, sitting there under sufferance, able to be kicked out again at will any time that he said or did anything that makes him Jeremy Corbyn. What's the point in being a member of Keir Starmer's Parliamentary Labour Party if the price of it is, as it would be, that you have to go along with every betrayal that Keir Starmer is currently engaged in? Rachel Reeves, is that her name? The Shadow Chancellor, just the other day declared that Labour is not in favour of public ownership of the gas industry, the electricity industry, the water industry. The precise opposite of what Starmer claimed when he was running for leader, by the way. But that's now the Labour position. They believe in private ownership of the once public utilities. They believe in war. They believe in Israel without equivocation, in the words of Keir Starmer. They believe in the Ukrainian Potemkin state and its maneuvers that run the risk of dragging us into a European war that could become a nuclear. What's the point? What's the point, Jeremy? And more importantly, to his supporters, what is the point in seeking readmittance to this misnamed Labour Party that has disgraced the very concept, the very idea of a Labour Party? We have a saying in Scotland, the game's a bogey. The game's over. Labour is over. It's never coming back. Jeremy's not coming back. Socialism is never coming back. Waving Palestinian flags at the Labour conference, it's never coming back. In fact, they're getting ready to remove even the handful, it's not even 2 hands full, of Labour members of Parliament that any longer believe in any of these things. They'll be deselected. They'll be replaced by Blairites. The Labour Party is now run by Sir Keir Starmer, Sir Tony Blair, unless we can stop it, and Lord Peter Mandelson, Jeffrey Epstein's bosom buddy. Just think about that. Get a hold of yourself and stop this nonsense. Leave the Labour Party. Stop giving them money to dance on the grave of everything that you ever believed in. We're the Workers' Party. We're not the finished article. Come in. You can be the leader. You can be the leaders. You can make the policies. Come in. Don't be put off by me if that's what's stopping you. Gee whiz, I'll not be here forever. Maybe not even at 10:30. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Every week at this time, join the Workers' Party weekly broadcast.